The night the phone rang, David was sitting alone in his small living room, half asleep in his old armchair. The television was on but muted, showing some late-night program he wasn't really watching. Outside, the streets were silent, the kind of silence that only existed in the middle of the night when the whole world seemed to pause for a few hours. David glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:00 a.m. He sighed and rubbed his eyes. Sleep had become difficult in recent years. At 67, memories had a strange habit of returning at night, when the house was quiet and there was nothing to distract him. Most nights, his thoughts drifted back to the same moment in his life, the year his younger brother Tommy died. Tommy had been 21 then, full of restless energy, always talking about the future, always chasing some new idea or adventure. David had been the responsible older brother, the one who tried to keep Tommy grounded. But none of that mattered after the phone call from the police. A terrible accident, they said. A car crash outside town. David still remembered the smell of the hospital hallway when he was asked to identify the body. The doctors warned him the victim had been badly burned, but David had known it was Tommy the moment he saw the necklace, a simple silver chain with a small cross. Their mother had given it to Tommy on his 18th birthday. David had buried his brother 3 days later. 42 years had passed since that day. And yet, some nights, it still felt like yesterday. The sudden ringing of the phone cut through the silence like a knife. David jumped slightly. Who on earth would be calling at this hour? The phone kept ringing, echoing through the quiet house. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Late-night calls were rarely good news, but something about it felt different. Slowly, he stood up and walked across the room. The clock now read 2:03 a.m. He picked up the phone. Hello? There was silence on the other end. Not the normal kind of silence either. It felt heavy, like someone was there, but struggling to speak. David frowned. Hello? Who is this? Then he heard it. A quiet breath, and a voice. David. The sound of his name sent a strange chill down his spine. The voice was older, rougher than he remembered, but there was something about it that felt painfully familiar. Then the man said something that made David's heart stop. It's Tommy. David felt his grip tighten around the phone. His mind instantly rejected what he had just heard. No, he whispered. The voice continued, calm but trembling slightly. David, it's me. For a moment David couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, like the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. This isn't funny, David said, his voice shaking. Whoever this is, stop it. A pause followed. Then the voice spoke again. You used to hide comic books under the loose board in the treehouse behind the old oak tree, the man said softly. David froze. You were afraid Mom would throw them away if she found them. The memories hit him like a wave. The treehouse, the hidden comics. That had been their secret when they were kids. No one else knew about that. David felt his legs weaken, and he slowly sat down on the edge of the couch. His heart was pounding now. Who are you? He asked quietly. Another long silence. Then the voice returned, softer this time. David, I just figured out who I am. A cold shiver ran down his spine. I know this sounds impossible, the man continued, but something happened last week. Memories started coming back. David shook his head, even though the caller couldn't see him. No, he whispered again. He had stood in that hospital room. He had looked at the body. He had signed the papers. He had buried his brother. You died, David said, his voice cracking. I saw you. On the other end of the line, the man let out a slow breath. That's what they wanted you to believe. David felt his stomach twist. What are you talking about? Another pause followed. When the voice returned, it carried a strange mix of sadness and quiet determination. They lied to you about what happened to me. The words hung in the air like a shadow. David stared at the dark window across the room, his reflection staring back at him. Who lied? He asked. But the man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said something else that made David's blood run cold. David, I remember the night of the accident now. David's fingers tightened around the phone. And? He asked slowly. The voice lowered to almost a whisper. It wasn't an accident. David sat in the dark long after the call ended, the phone still resting in his hand. The quiet hum of the house surrounded him, but his mind was anything but quiet. The words from the voice on the phone kept replaying in his head like a broken record. It wasn't an accident. For 42 years, David had lived with the belief that his brother had died in a tragic car crash. It had been sudden, heartbreaking, and senseless, but accidents happened. That was the explanation everyone accepted. But now that certainty had begun to crumble. David stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen. His legs felt heavy, as if the past itself had grabbed hold of him and refused to let go. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hands trembled slightly. The clock now read 2:47 a.m. Sleep was impossible now. Instead, David found himself drifting back into memories he hadn't visited in years. The hospital, the cold white lights, the quiet hallway where a police officer had gently placed a hand on his shoulder and asked him to be strong. David had been 25 then, barely old enough to understand the weight of loss. Tommy had always been the wild one, the younger brother who rushed into life without fear. When the police arrived at David's apartment that night in 1983, they told him Tommy's car had crashed on a dark road outside town. They said the vehicle caught fire after hitting a barrier. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. David could still remember how quickly everything had moved after that. Too quickly. The police had asked him to come to the hospital the next morning. They warned him that the body was badly burned, but they needed a family member to confirm the identity. He remembered the hesitation in his steps as he walked into that sterile room. A doctor had pulled back the sheet just enough for David to see the necklace around the victim's neck, a silver chain, a small cross. Their mother's gift. That had been enough. David had nodded through tears and signed the paperwork confirming it was Tommy. But now, sitting alone in his kitchen decades later, something about that moment felt different, incomplete. David set the glass down and walked toward the hallway closet. After a moment of searching, he pulled out a small, dusty box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were the last physical pieces of his brother's life. Old photographs, a baseball glove, a few letters Tommy had written when he briefly moved away for work, and the newspaper clipping. David unfolded the yellowed page carefully. The headline read, "Local man killed in late-night crash." He had read that article dozens of times over the years, but tonight he read it slowly, studying every word. Something caught his attention that he had never noticed before. Near the bottom of the article was a short sentence that seemed almost unimportant. Authorities also reported that another unidentified individual may have been involved in the incident. David frowned. Another individual? He leaned closer to the page. The article didn't explain further. It simply moved on, focusing on the tragedy of the crash. David felt a slow chill spread through his chest. Why had he never questioned that before? He reached for his phone and opened a search page, typing in the details of the accident. To his surprise, very little information appeared. Most records seemed incomplete, and some reports had been archived or restricted. That alone felt strange. Accidents usually left paper trails. Police reports, witness statements, insurance records. But the more David searched, the more it felt like pieces were missing. Then his phone vibrated in his hand, an unknown number. David's heart instantly began pounding again. He answered immediately. "Hello?" The same voice from earlier spoke quietly. "David, it's me." David closed his eyes for a moment. "I need answers," he said firmly. "Right now." There was a soft sigh on the other end of the line. "I know," the voice replied. "You deserve them." David leaned against the kitchen counter. "You said the accident wasn't real," he said. "So what happened?" The man hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "For a long time," he said slowly, "I didn't know. My memories were broken. Pieces missing." David felt his chest tighten. "But something changed last week," the voice continued. "I started remembering things, faces, places, and the night of the crash." "And?" David asked. The man spoke in a low, steady tone. "There was another car following me. David frowned. Following you? Yes. A short pause passed before the voice added something that made David's stomach drop. They forced me off the road. The room suddenly felt colder. You're saying someone caused the crash? David asked. Yes. David ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. But that still doesn't explain something, he said. What? David's voice lowered. I identified your body. Silence filled the phone for several seconds. When the man finally spoke again, his words were careful and heavy. That's the part you were never supposed to question. David's heart pounded. What do you mean? The voice on the other end grew darker, more certain. The body you saw that night. Another pause. Wasn't me. David barely slept after the second call. The sun had begun to rise by the time he finally sat down at the kitchen table again, staring at the old newspaper clippings spread out before him. His coffee had long gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. His thoughts kept circling around the same terrifying possibility. If the body he identified wasn't Tommy, then whose body had he buried? And more importantly, why? The phone call had ended abruptly the night before. Tommy, if it really was him, had promised to call again once it was safe. Those words alone had left David with more questions than answers. Once it was safe. Safe from who? The hours dragged slowly by. Every small sound in the house made David glance toward the phone. By early afternoon he could barely sit still. Finally, the phone rang again. David grabbed it before the second ring. Hello? David. The voice was the same, older, worn down by time, but unmistakably familiar. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David asked the question that had been burning in his mind all night. Where are you? A pause. Not far, Tommy replied carefully. Close enough. David let out a slow breath. Then we meet, he said firmly. Today. Silence followed. Then Tommy spoke again. There's a small diner outside town, the old highway road. Do you remember it? David thought for a moment. The Maple Diner? Yes. They used to stop there sometimes when they were younger, especially during late-night drives when Tommy couldn't sleep. I remember, David said quietly. Be there at 6, Tommy replied. The line went dead. The drive to the diner felt surreal. The familiar roads looked different now, as if time itself had shifted slightly. David kept thinking about the last time he saw his brother alive, the arguments they used to have, the jokes they shared, the small moments that once seemed unimportant. He pulled into the diner parking lot just before 6. The place hadn't changed much in 40 years. The old neon sign still buzzed faintly above the door, and a few pickup trucks were parked near the entrance. David sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Part of him was afraid to walk inside, because if the man waiting there wasn't Tommy, it meant someone had gone to incredible lengths to manipulate him. But if it was Tommy, then everything he believed for 42 years had been a lie. David finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The diner smelled of coffee and fried food. A few customers sat scattered in booths, quietly eating or talking. Then David saw him, a man sitting alone in the far corner, older. His hair was streaked with gray, and faint scars traced along the side of his face. His posture was cautious, almost guarded. But when the man looked up, David froze. Those eyes. They were exactly the same eyes Tommy had when they were kids. The man stood slowly. David, he said. David's heart pounded in his chest. Tommy, he whispered. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then the man gave a small, emotional smile. I was hoping you'd recognize me. David walked closer, studying his face. Time had changed him, but beneath the years and scars, the resemblance was undeniable. David shook his head in disbelief. This can't be real, he said quietly. Tommy gestured toward the seat across from him. Sit. David slowly lowered himself into the booth. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then David asked the question that had haunted him all night. What happened to you? Tommy leaned back slightly, as if preparing himself to finally say something he had carried for decades. "The crash happened exactly like I told you," he began. "A car forced me off the road." David listened carefully. "My car hit the barrier and flipped. I remember the sound of metal, glass breaking, then everything went dark." Tommy rubbed his hands together slowly. "When I woke up, I wasn't in a hospital. I was in a small room somewhere I didn't recognize." David frowned. "Kidnapped?" "In a way," Tommy replied. "They told me the accident had already been reported, and that everyone believed I was dead." David felt his chest tighten. "But why?" Tommy looked down at the table for a moment. "Because someone needed me to disappear." David leaned forward. "Who?" Tommy's eyes met his. "That's the part I didn't remember for years." "Until last week," David said. Tommy nodded slowly. "Yes." The memories had come back suddenly, triggered by something he had seen on television. A familiar face from the past, a face he once trusted. David felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You said someone betrayed you," he said. Tommy's expression hardened slightly. "Yes." "Who?" Tommy's answer came quietly, but it hit David like a thunderbolt. "Someone who stayed very close to you all these years." David stared at Tommy across the diner table, his mind racing. The words his brother had just spoken echoed inside his head. "Someone who stayed very close to you all these years." For a moment, David couldn't even form a response. The idea felt impossible. Everyone who had been close to him had shared the same grief when Tommy died. They had stood beside him at the funeral. They had comforted his mother. They had mourned. "Who are you talking about?" David finally asked, his voice low. Tommy looked around the diner carefully before answering. His movements carried the quiet caution of someone who had spent years watching his back. "Do you remember Michael Turner?" he said. David frowned immediately. "Of course I do." Michael had been their father's closest friend. After their parents passed away, Michael had practically become part of the family. He helped David handle paperwork after the accident. He even stood beside him during the funeral service. Michael had been there through everything. "He helped us," David said slowly. "He was the one who talked to the police after the crash." Tommy nodded once. "Exactly." David felt a heavy knot form in his stomach. "You're saying Michael had something to do with this?" Tommy leaned forward, his voice steady. "He had everything to do with it." David shook his head in disbelief. "That doesn't make any sense." "It didn't make sense to me either," Tommy replied. "Not until my memories came back." Tommy explained that on the night of the crash, he had discovered something he was never meant to see. Earlier that evening, he had stopped by a storage facility where Michael kept some of his business equipment. Tommy had only gone there to borrow a toolbox, but inside the storage unit, he had found something strange: boxes filled with documents, stacks of cash, and records that suggested illegal business deals stretching back years. At first, Tommy thought he must have misunderstood what he was seeing. Then Michael arrived. "He wasn't supposed to see me there," Tommy said quietly. David listened in stunned silence. Michael had panicked. According to Tommy, the older man realized immediately that Tommy had discovered far too much. "What happened next?" David asked. Tommy looked down at his hands. "He told me to forget everything I saw," he said. "He said it was none of my business." "And you didn't agree?" David guessed. Tommy gave a faint, bitter smile. "You know me." The argument had grown heated. Tommy had threatened to report what he found. That was when Michael made a decision. A terrible one. Later that night, Michael followed Tommy's car onto the highway. The crash that everyone believed was an accident had actually been carefully arranged. Michael forced Tommy's car off the road, but things didn't go exactly as planned. Tommy survived. "When I woke up later, Michael was there," Tommy said. "He told me the fire destroyed the car and that another body had been placed inside." David felt the blood drain from his face. "A stranger," Tommy continued. "Someone who had already died earlier that night." Michael used the chaos of the crash to switch identities. The burned body, combined with the necklace Tommy had been wearing, convinced everyone that the victim was him. "You were never meant to question it," Tommy said. David remembered the hospital again. The necklace, the rushed paperwork. Michael had handled everything. He moved me somewhere far away after that, Tommy said. Told people I had severe injuries. Over time, my memories faded. David swallowed hard. And all these years? I lived under another name, Tommy said, working small jobs, moving from place to place. I never understood why my life felt incomplete. Until last week. Tommy had seen Michael on a television interview about local businesses. The moment he saw his face, the memories returned like a flood. Everything. The storage unit, the crash, the betrayal. David sat back in the booth, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth. Michael Turner had been at family dinners. He had helped David repair his roof one summer. He had even spoken about Tommy with sadness in his voice for decades, all while knowing the truth. "So what do we do now?" David asked quietly. Tommy looked at him with a calm determination. "We take everything from him the same way he took everything from us." David raised an eyebrow. "Revenge?" Tommy shook his head. "No." He reached into his jacket and placed a small folder on the table. Inside were copies of financial records, old photographs, and documents Tommy had gathered since his memories returned. "Proof," he said. David slowly opened the folder, realizing what Tommy meant. Michael had built his life on lies, and now those lies were about to be exposed, not with violence, but with the truth. Weeks later, the story spread across the city. Investigations reopened, old records resurfaced. The evidence Tommy had collected led authorities directly to Michael's hidden dealings. The man who had once been trusted by everyone finally faced the consequences of his choices. For David, the real victory came on a quiet evening months later. The phone rang again, but this time it wasn't filled with fear or confusion. David answered with a smile. "Hey, David," Tommy said on the other end. His voice sounded lighter now. "It's really me this time." David leaned back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't felt in 42 years. Peace. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know."